The influences I'm channeling tonight are the Italian author Nanni Balestrini, born in 1935. In particular, I'm working kind of from his political novel, The Unseen, which describes an atmosphere of intense social change and upheaval in Italy in the 1970s, and describes in-house occupations, the creation of free radios, and also considerable state repression of social movements. And then also working a little bit with Proust's Cities of the Plain, which is volume 4 of In Search of Lost Time, with a bit of a swerve into Woolf. I couldn't resist. With both of these writers, I'm interested in the continuous unbroken sentence, the action of the continuous unbroken sentence, and the way that such sentences seem to reveal the shape of thought, or the time pace of thought, and thoughts as they overlap in a tidal way, the one pulling the next forward as it recedes, making the next one possible, and showing the contiguities, a kind of ecology of thought and thought forms. There's a particular effect when one reads these long sentences. You feel like you can't look up. There's no period. You're reading and reading, page up, you sort of propulsive sentences. You don't look up or pause. That experience of continuity is also an experience of vastness, as Auden wrote in his letter to Lord Byron. I want a form that's large enough to swim in. Virginia Woolf's novels offer just such a form. In fact, a small swimming fish is a metaphor for the beginning of thought in her cross-genre tract, A Room of One's Own, at the outset of which, and here I'm swerving away from Proust and Balestrini just for a moment, Woolf's, if you remember, plural protagonist, she has a plural protagonist comprised of 4 Marys, 4 historical Marys, are interrupted constantly by men, stopped and frisked, so to speak, for straying into zones that weren't legal for women to enter, grounds, libraries, in her historical moment and milieu. Because of these gendered jurisdictions, Woolf's 4 Marys keep getting interrupted. Naturally, they lose their train of thought. Woolf's protagonist sits. She's sitting by a body of water. A thought appears, she describes it as a small fish. Small, yes, but full of potential and movement. And then when the aspiring thinker is interrupted, it disappears. And this repeats over and over. When her thought, small as it is, moves her to move so that she gets up to pursue it, she's continuously interrupted by the representatives of patriarchal law, and she loses her little fish. Thinking and walking go together in this text. But the narrative, the sentences, pivot, not where her thought pivots, but rather where spatial prohibitions, juridical borders, let's call them formal constraints, force her elsewhere towards, among other things, the form of her own anger, or anger as form. Whatever that little fish was going to be, it is now diverted to the only possible remaining topic. What is the nature of this recursive, thought-destroying obstacle in my path? And the book sort of unrolls inexorably from there. The truncation of the movement of thought is a class condition. Sentences/thoughts are cut off because of political contingencies. I recently interviewed Kevin Killian for this special issue in Jacket on New Narrative, and he talked about how working as a secretary, he's constantly interrupted by the ringing telephone. So he writes in a fragmented fashion and has learned not to be too concerned with this. That sentence will always be there, he said. I myself recently became drawn to the unbroken sentence for a not unrelated reason. If I worked with a continuous sentence, I wouldn't have to start over, begin again every time I sat down to write in the extremely interrupted, minuscule amounts of time I have, given my own workload. Secondly, I wanted to write a narrative with propulsive momentum, in which every sentence was equally important. Now, how to do that? One way to make every sentence equally important is to have the whole piece simply consist of one sentence. And then there's the continuous sentence as a performance or enactment of the idea of continuous awareness, or maybe the impossibility of continuous awareness. Because we're creatures of intermittency, not only do we space out, but we go to sleep every day. When we read, we skip and skid, sometimes without even knowing it. So what might continuous awareness resemble? Lucid dreaming? Perhaps the unbroken sentence is more than anything a nocturnal form. Aline Sissou wrote in Writing Blind, "Even with my eyes open at noon, I am able to not see." So that's my preface. Now I'll read an excerpt of what is, I think, the longest sentence from Proust, followed by the excerpt from The Unseen, and then I'll read my own unbroken sentence. But due to lack of time, I'll only be able to read a short excerpt from Proust and Balestrini's sentences, obviously, which is a difficulty because you'd probably best get the effect of the duration of the sentences if we were just here all night and I just, and you'd have to go to Labo and get out of here. However, yeah, that wouldn't be possible because in Proust's case, the sentence is almost 1,000 words long, and in Balestrini's novel, the first sentence alone is some 10 pages long. So I'll just begin with Proust's melancholy, subtle, sadly polemical longest sentence in which Marcel expresses at once his fear of death and separation and also conflates and works with relating in his moment the oppression of Jews and queers in his world. Their honor precarious, their liberty provisional, lasting only until the discovery of their crime, their position unstable, like that of the poet who one day was feasted at every table, applauded in every theater in London, and on the next was driven from every lodging, unable to find a pillow upon which to lay his head, turning the mill like Samson and saying like him, "The two sexes shall die, each in a place apart, excluded even, save on the days of general disaster when the majority rally around the victim, as the Jews rallied around Dreyfus, from the sympathy, at times from the society of their fellows, in whom they inspire only disgust at seeing themselves as they are, portrayed in a mirror which, ceasing to flatter them, accentuates every blemish that they have refused to observe in themselves, and makes them understand that what they have been calling their love, a thing to which, playing upon the word, they have by association annexed all that poetry, painting, music, chivalry, aestheticism, have contrived to add to love, springs not from an ideal of beauty which they have chosen, but from an incurable malady. Like the Jews again, save some who will associate only with others of their race and have always on their lips ritual words and consecrated pleasantries, shunning one another, seeking out those who are most directly their opposite, who do not desire their company, pardoning their rebuffs, moved to ecstasy by their condescension, but also brought into the company of their own kind by the ostracism that strikes them, the opprobrium under which they have fallen, having finally been invested by a persecution similar to that of Israel, with the physical and moral characteristics of a race, sometimes beautiful, often hideous, finding, in spite of all the mockery with which he who more closely blended with, better assimilated to the opposing race, is relatively in appearance the least inverted, heaps upon him who has remained more so a relief in frequenting the society of their kind, and even some corroboration of their life, so much so that while steadfastly denying that they are a race, the name of which is the vilest of insults, those who succeed in concealing the fact that they belong to it, they readily unmask, with a view less to injuring them, though they have no scruple about that, than to excusing themselves and going in search, as a doctor seeks cases of appendicitis, of cases of inversion in history, taking pleasure in recalling that Socrates was one of themselves, as the Israelites claim that Jesus was one of them, without reflecting that there were no abnormals when homosexuality was the norm, no anti-Christians before Christ, that the disgrace alone makes the crime because it has allowed to survive only those who remain obdurate in every warning, to every example, to every punishment, by virtue of an innate disposition so peculiar that it is more repugnant to other men, even though it may be accompanied by exalted moral qualities than certain other vices which exclude those qualities, such as theft, cruelty, breach of faith, vices better understood and so more readily excused by the generality of men. So I'm going to stop there, even though it goes on and on and on to the break of dawn. And here's Balestrini from the opening of The Unseen, describing, again, a scene of state repression, the waves and waves of state repression that he was also a subject of, mass arrests in late 70s in Italy. This is a shorter excerpt. Then we climb a narrow stairway, semi-darkness, suffocating with long flights, high steps, aching tugs at the chains, hurting the wrists, and at the end of the last flight of the light of a small door, and we come out high, up at the top of a stairway, tears spreading into an enormous room, brightly lit, full of people moving down there. Beneath us, all of a sudden, against my leg, I feel an animal muzzle that growls threateningly, the pupils dilated, the large eyes protruding, two long, very white teeth bared by the tight red mouth, a massive dog arching its ears, pointing up, quivering all the time, the carabiniere holding its leashes impassive in his bulletproof overalls, the latest in anti-terrorist style. And then lastly, here's my piece, which is in progress, and I'm calling right now under parentheses decomposed, in which I adopt the unbroken sentence, as well as this stance of moral witness that I think I found in these influences that I selected for this evening, and I begin midstream, in which nothing is amiss, and in which you, the right shape in the rightly shaped world, a smooth plane, float in the medium of life, filled with ambiguous meanings, incomplete. Are you missing an essential feature, something chaotic, expedient perhaps, yet to come to the species, like telepathy or conscious reincarnation or knowledge of itself by a mind or a world, though she wasn't capable of imagining a world or a mind that could comprehend what it was at the moment it was represented to itself. She wondered for a long time what such a mind could be like, but she kept drawing a blank. She was capable of imagining other actions and garments, all sorts of free violence, gratis violence, and she thought of Caspar Hauser, a great complex of wills, taking orders from the void. A decision could seem correct. One question could have two or more equally valid answers, or one difficulty could paralyze them all. And while the dream of a classless society was fully accepted, actual classless society was not. It was stuck in the genre of realism or the genre of utopia, and classlessness was surrealism, as if all political desire and activity could only end in a good enough better world. And the rain fell outside of their window. It fell onto parched sand while an hour away a fire raged in a national park close to the city's reservoir. What she knew was that necessity would always come before will. Real necessity was purpose. Chosen purpose was something different. Some would say that a life of chosen purposes was the only free life, a life free not just of necessity's purposes, but of unwilled, received purposes, purposes from heaven, say, from hot nuclear heaven, the purpose of getting to something called heaven, or the purpose of being redeemed, or saving your people, which purposes could feel like necessities if one were born into a life that did not impart the difference between kinds of purposes, but rather imparted purposes without ever questioning the structure of a purpose, the species of purposes. Thank you.